Hi, it was a great talk. Thanks. One of the reasons why I came to this presentation was because when I first saw the website, this really reminded me of Kowloon Wall City. I don't know if you, yeah, you guys know about it. So the thing is, it almost seems as if this is a sort of a one-dimensional or like 1.5-dimension version of Kowloon Wall City, which I think is 20, 30 stories. I'm not really sure. So did you take a look at the work that has been done before in documenting that when you started this project?
I've never been to Kowloon Wall City. I think it was torn down before I was born. So I know of the work done, and I know the book and the drawings that were done, the sections showing the life within these buildings. That was very much an inspiration for my work as well.
And also for mine, because this Japanese photographer, Ryuichi Miyamoto, he went to Kowloon City for a number of years. He kept returning until it was torn down. So he was also taking this, well, it's not completely self-built housing, but he was taking this seriously and taking a close look at it and thinking it's worthwhile to show what it looks like. So that was a big inspiration, yes.
Thank you.
It's fascinating to see, like it looks like the way the villages are vernacularly built, as if they are rebuilt again on top of the buildings in the city. Are there, I don't know, any movies that are done on this subject that could show, for example, like maybe, yeah, the lifestyle somehow?
Me? Oh. Yes, there is a movie. There's a short film made by a woman living in California. Sybil Wendler is her name, and the film's title is, I can't remember, Once Upon a Rooftop. And she was actually inspired by our book, and it sort of reminded her of stories she'd heard as a child, and she felt she had to, look into this, and went to Hong Kong and made this short film. And you can find it on the internet, and it's very interesting, because actually in the film, you won't know it, but you'll see people whose homes we visited. So they talk to her.
Yeah, so the film is set in this building that's shown in the photograph right now. Yeah.
And we were hoping to find more historic material. We thought if we go to Hong Kong and work on this has been going on for decades. I mean, there's sure to be projects, and we actually hope to incorporate historic material into the book we made. Unfortunately, we tried hard, but we found very, very little. It really is one of those phenomena which are ignored by the people down on the street. It's somewhere up there, out of sight. It's a bit like the cellars in Beijing. No one knows about them, and if they do, we don't want to know about them. We found some historic material in the Information Services Department. Sometimes rooftop structures would have been photographed by chance. If they were building a new road, someone would take a photograph of that new road. But if you look at the photograph to the left and to the right of the road, the houses, the roofs would be full of huts. So we found photos like that from the 70s. We even found 2, 3, 4 photos by a Hong Kong photographer who worked in the 50s, and he was sort of interested in the way ordinary people live, and he showed some rooftop scenes. So there's proof that it's been going on for a very long time, but no one seems to have bothered to do it in a systematic way.
Except for the Buildings Department of Hong Kong. So these are not public records, but I met a friend who works in the Buildings Department, and he took me there. They have very detailed photographs and documentation of all the huts in Hong Kong. There'll be plan drawings, photographs. In fact, if you look at some of the interior photographs that Stefan took, there are markers, so there are numbers kind of cataloging all the spaces, and they visit it regularly to make sure that people are not building more of them. But of course, normally people won't be able to access these documents, but yeah, they keep track and they know.
So that's really scary in a way. I don't think it's only the buildings department, it's several departments in Hong Kong, and they
Well, the
keep
fire
track,
department would be interested in
they
this.
keep track of these structures, and they use, well, really, their record looks like ours. Maybe they didn't use a large format camera, and of course, mostly their knowledge was gathered against the residents' will. But somewhere in Hong Kong, you have miles of files on this phenomenon. It's well documented, but you'll never see it because it can't be shown.
Yeah, I was wondering when the residents are evicted, how does it happen? How long do they have to leave? And is it as usual? I guess they're always relocated on the outskirts of the city, or are they left on their own? Or
I think, okay, legally, all of these structures are unauthorized building works. So when the time comes, you can either choose to tear down your own hut, or the government will do it for you and send you a bill for it. So the people who are eligible, I think social workers would help them apply for public housing. And if you're not eligible, then you're left on your own to find alternative options.
thanks.
Oui, je vais poser la question en français. Il y avait des bateaux anciennement dans le port, je crois, des bateaux un peu similaires avec des gens, un peu comme des maisons comme ça, mais sur l'eau, des boathouse, I guess.
I'm sorry, we need some translation.
There were barges, boats in the surroundings. Is that the question?
On the water, there was some boathouses, similar to those on the rooftop, but on the water.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess there's no more that kind of boathouse nowadays.
I would imagine that to be another vanishing housing type in Hong Kong. I think due to pollution and stuff like that, it's harder and harder for the fishermen to make a living in Hong Kong. And when the parents get older and they retire, but they don't want their children to continue on with this way of making a living, so there's no one to kind of take over the boathouses. So from as far as I know, it's also a vanishing type.
Yep.
Hi. What are the logistics of carrying, say, about 200 square feet of corrugated metal roofing surreptitiously up to the top of a roof? I mean, there's so much material up here. How do they get away with it?
I think in a lot of the older buildings, no one is watching. A lot of these buildings, the staircases are not locked. There's no one sitting there guarding. So we walk up and down freely. No one ever asked us why we were here. But when we went in 2007, we didn't meet any of the original builders of rooftop homes. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. It's like, how do you carry all this stuff up there?
Well, I think actually it must have been carried up, but we heard that, for instance, with a building like that, after it had been built, all the flats would be sold off individually, and if you bought one on the top floor, then you'd maybe pay a little more and be able to use the rooftop space for anything. So it might actually often be the case that people living on the top floor, regular flats, would build a hut or rent out that space for someone to build a hut. And I think that's how it probably often started. So there might be, there are all these informal economies, and there might be a few extending down into the regular building.
So that's where the rent was paid, people underneath in general.
Now, of course, after 50 years, rent is being paid to God knows whom. Yeah, might be, you know, usually they pay rent to someone, but if that, whether that person is still living in that house, or whether that person at one point bought that hut and is now letting it, you know, whatever.
Yes, I would like just a little precision. What is this picture? It's in Kowloon or in Hong Kong? Because I have been there and they call it Hong Kong, just the island, and the rest is Kowloon. So,
this is in Kowloon. This is in Dai Kok Choi area, so it's just west of Mong Kok.
We were hoping to get a picture of a rooftop settlement with the Hong Kong skyline in the background, but of course these old houses aren't high enough, so we didn't get that.
I was wondering about the social relationships between people on the roof, and then between them and the people living in the building. Because I guess on the roof, maybe there could be good social relationships, but between them on the roof and then in the building, maybe there is some sort of tension happening somewhere. I wonder.
I think it's very hard to generalize. We went up one very interesting building and would have liked to have worked up on that roof, but they didn't really want us to do that. And on this roof, there lived women who all came from the same village on the mainland. So we would have been very keen to hear their stories, but in the end they were very friendly. But I said, no, this is our home and we don't want to, so we couldn't do that. And I guess it's up there. It's like probably in any village or in any regular building. Neighbors get on well with each other, and sometimes they don't, sometimes they ignore each other. But what was this guy who told us that they actually would help each other mend the roof?
Yeah, so we met one of ex-rooftop dweller who's since then moved to a public housing unit. So when we asked him, so what was it like living on the rooftop when you were there? He said, everybody works together as a community, and they would share meals and have celebrations on the rooftop during festivals, and they would make work together, like all the fathers who are on the rooftop would meet and work together to fix everybody's roof to make sure that it's not leaking and everything is well attended to. So it was a very fond memory in his mind. And also I think on the rooftop, the corridors really become an extension to people's living space. So whether they're storing stuff outside, sometimes they're cooking outside, or fixing furniture. So you get more of a chance to encounter your neighbors and get to know them that way, in a very indirect way. Whereas in a regular flat, everybody kind of just goes into their flat, close the door, turn on the air conditioning, and that's it, right?
I have a question about the culture of architectural education. You mentioned Rudofsky, and certainly in North American and European schools, I think there's been a strong interest in vernacular architecture and documenting these kinds of movements since the early 70s, say. And I wonder whether in Hong Kong and in nearby areas in mainland China, say, there's the same interest that's starting, or that you see that at all, or whether this is something that people in architecture schools are not really interested in, or whether your research has sparked some interest, perhaps.
I think definitely in Hong Kong, people are starting to recognize the value of local vernacular. So whether it's rooftop housing or the kind of local craftsmen, there are social groups that are different groups that are starting to document them and record the stories and learn about how things were done back in the day. In Shenzhen and Guangzhou, there are these migrant villages that have emerged in the last 20 or 30 years. And I know Urbanus, it's a Shenzhen and Beijing-based architecture firm. They've done a series of documentation on this very specialized migrant housing type. So what happens is, in the case of Shenzhen, the city keeps growing and they have to keep acquiring farmland. So to compensate to the farmers for taking over their land, everyone is given a plot of 10 meters by 10 meters plot of land. And so they can't farm on this area. So what they started to do is keep building these high-rises and renting them out to migrant workers. And now they're called handshake buildings because from one building you can literally reach over and shake hands with someone across on the other side of the street. So Urbanus, like that's one specific example that I know, documented this phenomenon very well. So, yeah.
Hello? Hi. I guess I just wanted to talk a little, or I was wondering if you could talk more about the eviction process. I mean, you made a comment at the beginning of your presentation that maybe this was just a heroic comment, but about how there's a discourse of criminality or danger in relation to like these kinds of informal structures. So, like, does that play at all into eviction, or is it really just like a bureaucratic measure, or is it like in the so-called danger, like physical danger in terms of being a fire hazard, or like I don't know if like you could talk a little bit more about that.
I think the general perception, so at the beginning of the research I asked many people like whether they know about these places, and they've heard about it, but nobody's ever been on top of a rooftop hut. Nobody has ever met anyone who lives on a rooftop hut. So I don't know if it's something that we don't, the unknown, then it causes a certain type of fear. So the general public would think that it's a very dangerous place and filled with criminals, but from our experience, it was not like that at all. So I've never heard of criminal activity being a reason for eviction of rooftop housing, but certainly fire hazards. So every time there's a rooftop fire, then then the government will become very proactive in cleaning up these building rooftops. But in general, they're tolerated until a developer comes in and say, well, we want to develop these 3 blocks or something like that, then they would be the first layer to go.
I'm just wondering if this type of rooftop housing, is it a uniquely Hong Kong thing, or does it exist elsewhere?
Well, Cairo apparently has a lot of people, a huge amount of people living on the roofs of buildings. There was a very good documentary on that on German TV. And there, they reckon it started with the caretaker of the building. He'd have a hut on the roof, and someone he would get in his family into the city, and they would get in their friends, and now you have, I forget the figures, but in Cairo, this must also be a huge phenomenon. Anywhere else?
My friends have told me that Taiwan also has some rooftop housing, but we never visited.
Oh yeah, and the Austrian guy said actually in Taiwan it doesn't seem to be so much rooftop housing, but rooftop, they're producing things up there. Oh. But I don't know, so some more projects there.
Hello? Okay. Hey. I guess sort of a follow-up question about the criminal element. My curiosity was that it seems like a situation that's rife for someone to take advantage of those people, especially when you're talking about, like, we don't really know where the money, like where the rent goes to, and so there are people who are. I mean, this happens all over, right? Where people who are outside of the law or on the edge of the law, they sort of make prime candidates for to be taken advantage of. And I guess, I was just curious if you came across that element at all, or if it's really just sort of microeconomics at work.
We didn't. I don't think we met anyone who thought he was being exploited up there. We certainly met people who thought their home was very, very terrible and they wanted to get away quickly. And you can clearly see this in the book and in the pictures. I mean, some of these places are completely ramshackle, but often it would be the case that people would say, this is just a rooftop hut. I'm not proud of it, but at the same time, maybe it gives me a bit more opportunity to shape my surroundings than I had before in a regular flat. So we heard those stories, quite a few times. One of the issues of eviction is, if anyone is compensated at all, it will probably be the owner of the hut, and not the one living in there. Because if the owner can prove, this really belongs to me and I've been in Hong Kong for, 30 years and so on, then he might be compensated, but certainly not the tenant.
A couple of questions. Firstly, for the Cairo examples, there's a feature film, Yacubian Building, at the beginning of which it's based on a novel, but general interest. It's in English, or English subtitled. It talks about how the rooftop servants' quarters turn into migrants' quarters, and it talks about the class conflict between people living on the regular flats, in the regular flats, versus the immigrants up on the roof. So my questions, firstly, I was wondering, you mentioned, okay, they can get rid of the rainwater by plugging into the building's existing pipework, but I'm familiar more with squatter settlements, so how do they network, how do they plug into the city network for instance, electricity and fresh water? In many cases, like in squatter settlements, the provision of these services wouldn't be dependent on title deeds. Second question, was there any legalization route? For instance, I was really intrigued by your statement that the local authorities, building inspectors, kept a close watch on these residents so that they wouldn't do additions and so forth. And then this brings, was there any corruption that you observed? How do they maintain? What's the, that relation? How do they maintain that relationship? Or where do they say, no, this is too much addition. This, you have to stop here. Does your research in many squatter settlements, the extra-legal status of the settlements were maintained strategically as part of national housing policies? And do you see a shift in the broader housing policy of Hong Kong? So too many questions, I suppose. And finally, how does redevelopment occur? It's just because your talk was so inspiring, thought-provoking. Like you mentioned these buildings, for instance, the one we are looking at, it was built by a developer and individual flats were sold. So how come a developer come and redevelop a couple of the buildings Do they go through public-private partnerships and use eminent domain to purchase the buildings in their entirety? So I think I'll stop there.
What was the first question again?
The first question, I think, was a question to the architect about the structure and how do they plug into the infrastructure of the house. And then how does that relate to the legal status and receiving services?
So I think that brings me back to like a very controversial time for rooftop housing in Hong Kong. In the mid-1990s, there was a big protest in Mong Kok because the legal status of these rooftop huts became a very central question. So the electricity, water, if you call, you can get these services connected to the rooftop huts. So in the eyes of certain government departments, they recognize these as dwellings, and they do provide services, and they're metered, so you pay for water, you pay for your electricity.
You receive mail.
You receive mail. But in the eyes of the fire department and the buildings department, these are seen as illegal structures. So there's a conflict there back in the day. And so now it's very clear that all of these are illegal, and if you do purchase one of these huts, you can still get the services that you need and you pay for them, but when eviction time comes, then you have you do not need to be compensated for. Another interesting point is that the housing authority also recognizes these as properties. So the irony is that, so if you buy a rooftop hut and you live there and you get evicted, you as a property owner is not eligible for to apply for public housing. So it was a source of big controversy. And then the second question, you have to remind me.
Kind of related to the degree of control and planning regulation with regards to the rooftop huts, and so how much regulation is in place by the controlling authorities for further extensions and further additions and further layering?
I think any new addition is not permitted, and anything that's existing is tolerated until it's time for eviction. Yeah, I think that's the status.
And then, an interesting question, as far as I understood, is whether tolerating these rooftop settlements is also strategic by the government in order to not have to build too much public housing. I mean, I can't answer that question. I only know that Hong Kong at least used to have the second largest public housing program after Singapore in the world, so they were obviously building a lot of stuff, but it never seemed to be enough. Now, on my last visit to Hong Kong, people were telling me they were cutting down on the public housing, so I don't know, but I'm really no expert on that. What else did we have?
Good evening. I'm just wondering, because where I grew up, the government would be very interested in these structures nominally for safety reasons, but really they'd be much more interested as they would go, oh, you have this on the top of your building and it's generating revenue, so would they increase your estate tax, your property tax? Because where I live, they'd be very interested in increasing your property tax if you built something on top of your house.
I don't think we ever asked how much property tax people pay.
But I think they do pay some sort of tax up there, don't they? That was in addition to paying for electricity and water, and I think there's something, in some ways it's recognized as property, so there was some tax, but sorry. There's a very good essay in our book, and it touches upon a lot of the legal issues, so maybe we can refer to that. But interestingly enough, this essay, so we met people who said, you know, our rooftop place is cheaper than we were before. And for Dr. Choi, who wrote the essay for us, he, of course, looked at statistics and census material, and he came to the conclusion that people would actually, they might be ripped off. They would be paying more for their rooftop space than people living in a comparable area in a regular building. So I think, again, it's very hard to generalize. Maybe people are even willing to pay a bit more in order to be up there and not downstairs in the partition flat. It's certainly a very complex issue and might also be different from building to building.
Thank you. Perhaps we'll close the questions now. If you have further questions, Stefan and Rufina will stay here for another few minutes. You can direct your questions there. I'd like to thank you both for coming to CCA and presenting your project. And that's it. Thank you very much.